there's been lots of discussions online where the Lost Garden is located. Mm-hmm. And there's especially one fan theory that the Sisi and Norn came from outer space. So will we find out where the Lost Garden is at some point in...
We will learn a lot more about the garden. That is the source of for those who haven't read the books, the Scythian Norn are one people who have split into these essentially two tribes. We will learn a lot more about that. We will learn how that actually happened, where it started in time, because we're learning more about these people's cultural history as well. But we will learn a lot more of the stories and legends and what happened immediately after they came from the garden and arrived in Osten Ard, which is analogous to our world. So I can't promise I will exactly answer that question, but I will definitely give people a much, much better idea. In other words, I will change the terms of the debate into something much more specific and much less general than it is now.
Oh, cool. Interesting. Talking about the evolution of races. You have, like in Memory, Sorrow and Thorn, we have the Scythi and the Norn, who are very close to the elves in Tolkien. Then in War of the Flowers, there's the fairies, who are, more contemporary. Mm-hmm. And then in Shadow March, there's the Car, who are way off, very weird, different from... Mm-hmm. So now you're going back to Scythi and Norn. Will that evolution feature? So, in a nutshell, how much Scythian Norn is in the Car, and will there be Car in the Scythian Norn of the new books?
Okay, well, here's the basic thing with me. One of the reasons I like fantasy is because I very much like the idea of the other being given some kind of tangible form. By the other, I mean like the idea of that which is different from us. And one of the great things about fantasy and science fiction is that you can make that explicit. You don't have just people. You have people meeting things that aren't people, but can reason and converse and war and all these other things. So for me, all of those, the Scythi, the Car, Quar, however you want to pronounce it, all these different folk, the fairies of War of the Flowers, are all versions of the other. So in each case, I'm using different aspects to point out different things that interest me. In the case of the Norn and the Norn and the Scythi folk, what really interests me most about them is, in fact, what makes them different from the mortals. So I think we will see very much a continuation of the Scythi and Norn as they were in the first books, but we will simply see them in greater detail, especially the Norns, who were, we hardly saw any of their culture or background or anything in the early books. These we will definitely see a lot. We will go to where they live. We will spend time among them. I have characters who are main characters who are Norn, Hikedaya, as their name truly is. So we won't see anything markedly different about them, but we will learn a lot more about them. They will become much more realistic, and that was what will be interesting to me, is if they can still be as frightening and fearsome and make as good enemies and villains when we begin to know them as people with their own hopes and fears and all of that kind of stuff. So that's what really interests me, is when you begin to find out about the other as something that is, yes, different from you, but also in some ways disturbingly similar. And I think that's where the...
So can you keep the enemy trope once you get to know somebody?
Yeah, because they still are a danger. They are still dangerous, and they still are an enemy. And they hate the mortals, and that most of them absolutely detest and want to destroy the mortals. So the danger is very real, but we're also going to see more, because I've never been interested in villains that are essentially villains because that's their position, because most real-world, scary, awful people to us do not think of themselves that way. The kind of people that would put a bomb on a bus or a train, the rest of us are just like, oh my God, we can't even imagine people like that, and we think of them as monsters. And in terms of what they do, they are monsters. But they don't think of themselves
Yeah.
as monsters. They think of themselves oftentimes as having a holy calling, or they're trying to save their own people, or, get revenge for some terrible injustice that was done to them. So that's what I want to do, is start to look at how that feels on the other side in this fantasy situation. Like as if Tolkien had suddenly said, what is the home life of your average orc like?
Yeah.
That's the question I want to look at.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds really intriguing. So as the world is broadening, and as many people are really geeks of where is stuff, will we get new maps with new books?
Yes, we will definitely have some new maps. We may even for once have a map done by somebody who's better at it than I am. But I'll wait until we make any announcements we make as to what we've decided to do. But there will definitely be new maps, there will be new indexes, there are a zillion new characters, plus a ton of old characters about whom we will find out new things. So, all the folks who are like me and are geeky about this stuff, I can promise you that they will not be complaining. They will not be going, gee, there just aren't any 1,000 new characters in this book, and new locations and new towns and cities and roads and history and economic backdrops and blah. No, there'll be all that stuff there because that's how I work.
Okay, cool. Are there any characters in your books that are published so far, or especially in the Memory, Sorrow and Tone, but not limited to that, that you now wish you hadn't had to kill? Either because they'd be useful to have around now, or other because you just like to write them and missing to write them now.
Well, first of all, you have to remember that not only am I a fantasy science fiction writer, but my earliest background in storytelling was in large part from comic books. So we never think of anybody as dead. That's the first thing you have to understand about me. Because I'm writing fantasy and science fiction, if I really wanted to, I could bring back anybody.
Okay.
I try not to do that beyond the bounds of what is acceptable. And again, that's with fantasy, where's the line? Obviously some people thought Tolkien got away with it with Gandalf, other people didn't. Some people were outraged that Gandalf wasn't dead. I'm very careful about that stuff. I don't want anybody having a reaction of like, oh, that totally ruins the book for me. So if somebody's dead, they're probably dead. Okay, that's the first thing. But again, I do come from a background where there are always loopholes where you can figure out ways to bring somebody back. Now, I'm not going to try and do it too much, I promise. As far as are there characters that I wish I hadn't killed off, no, because as interesting as characters might be for me, I don't have a problem creating characters, and I can pretty much always find a new and interesting way to make a character to fill a slot. Okay, none of my stories, actually, without trying to get into too long an explanation, one of the interesting things I think about the way that I write is I trust my characters to do what they should do based on who they are. And so as a result, instead of trying to force the characters to do things to make the plot I've already figured out work, I tend to let who the characters are determine how a lot of the plot goes, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I don't say, okay, I must have a character here who's going to do this, and then do this, and then do this, and then do this, and then invent a character that fits that slot. Because I usually feel, as a reader, that I can tell when that has happened. Yeah. Okay? So what I try to do is I say I need to have 2 or 3 or 4 characters of whom one is going to have to do this, may also have to do this, And so I'll guide those characters along, but I'll also have to trust as they develop. Some of them will wind up going off in completely opposite directions, I may have to grab another character and use them instead to do that, right? So I try not to force the character into a situation. That said, there's very seldom a time I feel like, oh, I wish I had that old character, because I'm much more interested in letting the new characters find their way into the plot and influence the plot based on who they are, than saying, oh, I wish I had an old character because they'd fit here really well. The only reason I ever miss characters is when they're particularly fun to write. And that's usually, but not always, either because they're funny or they're horrific. Those are the two main reasons that I will fall in love with a character. And I don't mean fall in love in the sense that like, oh, such a nice person. You know, oh, Dredd from Otherland.
Yeah, that's what I was asking. So Dredd might be back at some time.
He's my buddy. You know, if I create somebody who's an absolute psychotic, what's fun about it is getting to be a psychotic, at least on paper, for a short amount of time without having to actually torture and murder people and do horrible things. But in fact, to make readers go, ugh. You know, that's the fun part, making a reader go, ooh, ooh.
You're very good at that.
Thank you.
I can assure you.
I do enjoy that. But so, you know, as a result, those characters are really fun to write. But so are the funny ones. I love, like, again, we'll talk about two characters from Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. I really loved writing Benedict. You know, the troll, once he started and he began to come up with these little words of wisdom and stuff, I just enjoyed the heck out of that. You know, I really enjoyed that, and I would think of, like, how would Benedict see this? You know, what would he say? And how weirdly garbled would the syntax be so that you have to, like, think about it for a second before you understand, you know. So I really enjoyed that. Or the whole thing that, you know, you have a minor character. There's a guy named Lenti, who most, you know, veteran readers of the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn books remember. His nickname was Avi Stetto. Yes, yeah. I have a knife. And he was such a jerk. And when he finally meets up with his Grimner, without going into the details for those who haven't read the book yet, but his Grimner is a major character in the books, but he was also a favorite because he was funny in his own way. And when he meets up with this jerk face of a character...
One of my favorite scenes.
Exactly.
In
I loved writing that. It was just like... Because you're getting to, like, finally do what the readers wanted to do all along.
Exactly.
Through a character, you know? And you get to do it because you know his Grimner. It's totally in keeping with who he is and his personality. So characters like that, either the ones who are minor funny characters or the big characters who are just enjoyable because they do have a sense of humor and they have things to say and they have ways of looking at things. Those are really fun to write. But I never feel like, oh, I wish I hadn't killed them, because if I have killed them, I killed them for a reason, and you know, I'd rather come up with a new character. I enjoy making characters.
Okay, and yeah, another general one. Are there any story elements or characters or plots, creatures, whatever, that you thought of at some point and never managed to fit in any of your stories? Are there people, things in your head that just never fit and that stick with you?
Occasionally, but again, usually I've always been, I mean, for one thing, I write really long books, so there's almost always a place to stick something in if I come up with it. And I write books also, because my books are not, like, everything does not lead directly to the plot. You know, there are elements, I try to make these worlds feel real, and therefore there are things happening off to the side. There are little, you know, backwaters, there are small side trails that we take where we meet characters who are sort of involved in the book, but they're not really crucial. They're more like giving you a feeling of how the world is and who lives there. And in the same way, there's like monsters and stuff. I can almost always find a way to tuck them in. I mean, again, back to Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, there's like a 45-foot crocodile in the swamp called the Ran in the second or third book. I can't remember. And there's no point of that there except that it's just this cool thing, this giant crocodile that, you know, they refer to as, you know, I don't know, old grandfather or something, and they just see him as they go past. And that totally goes back to me being a kid and loving the things that you glimpse but you don't actually see up close. You know, I loved in The Lord of the Rings when I first read it as a kid that there were Nazgul, the ring wraiths, who you never knew their story. You knew they had a story, but you know, at that point in Tolkien, you still don't actually. There's still ring wraiths whose names we don't know because Tolkien never bothered to figure them out. And as a reader, I actually like that. I like that feeling of there's a world out there that I haven't entirely mapped out that still remains mysterious. So even at the end of these books that I'm working on, by the time I finish them all, yes, a zillion things will be explained, but a lot of new questions will open up, and there will be new things that are not known and stuff like that, because that's how it feels real.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I want to say. Yeah, that's what makes the world real. So you already said that you're reading tons of non-fiction to sustain your world building. What were the most helpful, influential non-fiction words you used so far for the new books? And did you change the story to fit in something interesting you read there?
Oh, absolutely. That happens all the time with all of my books. And the key to that is to make it so that the readers don't notice it, or if they do notice it, it's only in a kind of like, ooh, that's an interesting idea, but not, oh, I can see he was desperate to use some of his research material. And I have seen
So no
books
information dump.
Yeah, exactly. And I have seen books like that where it's like really obvious that this person went, by God, I just spent 14 hours studying this particular thing, and everybody else is going to suffer with me, and they're all going to hear all the things that I learned about it. I don't like that. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a book by I've just forgotten his first name, Pye, called The Edge of the World, which was given to me by, I think my son gave it to me as a Christmas or birthday present, and it's about the beginnings of modernity in Northern Europe because of things like the people living in the lowlands and up into the upper places of like Frisia and stuff like that, and all the trading and the fact that money came along for the first time because so many in that part of the world, because so many of these cultures were trading back and forth across the North Atlantic, and they couldn't barter anymore because what people needed was so, oftentimes didn't jibe, and so they began to have to use things like money to give things value that was independent of different countries and stuff. So I can't remember if it's William Pye or whatever, but anyway, there's a ton of books, including like a group called the Beguines, who I never knew about, who were a non-religious women's order, who maybe people in France already knew about them. I didn't.
I actually wrote a thesis.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Okay. Well, there is a version of this which is now going to show up. At least in the first book, it's so far in the background, it's barely even mentioned.
Yeah.
But is going to show up in the books because it's part of the history of one of the major characters.
Okay.
So so there's stuff like that always finds its way in, and when I find a book like this one or any number of other things, there's a one about horse fire the wheel or something, which is about the early Indo-Europeans and the development of Indo-European languages tracked through various old poems and stories and stuff. And I've got a book on the grasslands and the empires of the Mongols and the Huns and all that, and all of this stuff is making its way in. So yeah, there are definitely a bunch of my new books I've come across that have joined the many piles of older books that have all fed into this story.